Hello, everyone. I'm Kate Sears-Patowski, Programming Director for Expo Chicago, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Practices of Conservation from Exhibition to Environmental Impact, presented in partnership with the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, and media partner Art News. The panel kicks off our Friday programming for Alternate Assembly, a digital symposium featuring leading curators, artists, and scholars, addressing how ideas in contemporary art can contribute to rethinking our natural constructed environments. As the pandemic has forced institutions, galleries, and artists to reconsider their methods of operation, in October 2020, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles announced the creation of an environmental council, the first for a major art museum in the United States. A range of arts-based resources, councils, and coalitions have continued to develop throughout the past year, advancing their focus on sustainable, climate-aware practices of artists and institutions, advocacy for carbon neutrality and reduction, and environment justice-oriented programming and exhibitions within the cultural sector. In this panel, co-founders of MOCA's Environmental Council, Art+Acres, Art+Climate Action, Galleries Commit, and Art2Zero will discuss specific aims, such as reducing carbon emissions by 50% by 2030 in line with the Paris Agreement, and adoption of zero waste practices. How can the art world reduce emissions and engage more sustainable methods in an adaptive manner that supports engagement from across the art world? This panel is designed to connect the audience with considerations and resources for sustainable practices at a studio, exhibition, and institutional level. It is my great pleasure to welcome Laura Lupton, a gallery worker, creative project consultant, and co-founder of Galleries Commit, a worker-led collective initiated in 2020 that is committed to a climate-conscious, resilient, and equitable future for New York galleries. Jody Roberts, an independent curator, historian, and co-founder of Art+Climate Action, a California-based collective uniting nonprofit art spaces, commercial endeavors, art workers, patrons, and artist studios in the fight for environmental justice. Haley Mellon, an artist, co-founder of MOCA Los Angeles' Environmental Council, and founder of Art+Acres, a not-for-profit that supports the art community and having a permanent impact on wildlands. And Ellen Langen, an independent consultant, curator, and co-founder of Art2Zero, a New York City-based organization dedicated to accelerating a just transition to a net zero emissions future for the visual arts. I'm thrilled to welcome Haley, Laura, Jody, and Ellen to the screen. Unfortunately, Mika Rotenberg will not be able to join us today. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us. So I think we're going to go through some quick presentations just to give some background on the organizations you each represent. I'd love to start with Laura to give some background onto Galleries Commit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction and for having us on the panel today. I'm Laura Lupton. I'm a gallery worker and a co-founder of Galleries Commit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Galleries Commit is, kind of our history and where we're focusing right now. Galleries Commit, as Kate said, we are a worker-led collective committed to a climate-conscious, resilient, and equitable future for New York City galleries. We emerged in 2020 out of conversations that had been happening between gallery workers with a shared concern around the climate crisis, and really being interested in experimenting to see if it was possible to co-create an art world that we wanted to see in the future while operating within our current roles. So Galleries Commit has a real focus on building community, sharing knowledge, and specifically responding to what individual gallery workers need in order to advocate for and shape the direction of change within our galleries. So we launched in 2020 with an open commitment, which is still available for signatures on our website at galleriescommit.com. And that letter did a few things. First, it acknowledged that there's a climate crisis and the way that climate crisis intersects with racial, labor, and other forms of structural injustice. It commits individuals that sign to think critically about action they could take within their role at a gallery, to speak up about proposing alternatives when engaging with colleagues, artists, vendors, institutions, collectors, other people that are stakeholders in the space. And 3, listing your name publicly on the site so that others can identify you as an ally who wants to be engaging in these conversations and collaborate on finding better ways to do things. That letter had been circulated with a survey attached to it, and that survey was gathering information about what action galleries were already taking, what we thought were the most important areas to address and also where we needed the most support. And it also crowdsourced from the community ideas for actions and resources that we had already kind of in one central space. After spending last year really building community within that network through a series of dialogues and conversations, Galleries Commit now maintains a community platform of workers, artists, and allies from over 60 New York City galleries. And something that's really strong about that network is that it's split pretty evenly. So of the gallery workers that have signed, about 30% of those are identified as owners or senior partners of galleries, about 30% are directors, and about 40% are assistants, archivists, art handlers, registrars, other roles throughout the space. Plus we have almost 100 artist signatures and tons of allies on top of that. The community primarily functions through, we host a monthly meeting, a Slack chat, and an email list. We also have a database for climate action that's been taken by our community, as well as resources to support that action on our website. And we maintain a collective large-scale land conservation partnership with Art+Acres, which is really spearheaded by Haley Mellon, who's also on this call. One of the key resources that came out of last year's dialogues in response to what individual gallery workers were repeatedly saying that they needed in order to be able to advocate for change within their galleries was this idea for a step-by-step guide or some kind of template plan. In response to that, the Galleries Commit Collective used all of these ideas crowdsourced from the collective last summer, the conversations we'd been having with other leaders in the climate action field, to create a sample climate action plan for gallery workers to be able to introduce to their teams that has a proposed framework and some ideas for specific actions to take. The idea is that this can be used for gallery operations as a whole or adapted as a case study for a specific exhibition or project that you're working on. That plan recognizes something that was really key in our conversations, that all of our models are actually really specific to our own gallery spaces. So we have unique values, we have unique concerns, we have unique resources that are available to us. So the plan is not intended to be something that's didactic, but rather a starting place for conversation to be able to adopt or adapt as relevant to your gallery in particular. But it does encourage all gallery action plans to think critically about addressing 4 key categories that came out of last year's conversations. So those 4 core categories of a climate action plan that I would also echo for an exhibition action plan when you're thinking about something would be: first, calculating and reducing emissions; 2, minimizing waste; 3, supporting staff to take climate action. And that means both within the gallery context, but also so that they're supported as citizens of the broader world to show up as climate conscious citizens outside of their workplace as well. And 4, contributing to really shifting paradigms around what our current status quo and expectations are. I can speak a little bit more about kind of what falls into each of those categories if it comes up later on this call, but for now I'll leave this little summary there and just end with reiterating that, yeah, Galleries Commit has been a worker-led collective committed to this climate conscious, resilient, and equitable future that really is striving to center the voices and the needs of individuals and workers to help co-create a future we want to be a part of and shape the direction of the change we're making.
Thank you so much, Laura. I really appreciate you giving that intro. I'm going to have Jody now from Art and Climate Action give a little bit of an intro for her organization as well.
Thank you, and thanks, Kate, for the invitation. Really appreciate it. So our initiative started in the midst of California's record-breaking wildfires of 2020. As I'm sure many of you know, more than 4 million acres burned in California last year, and this was not by any stretch a freak event. It was really just the latest in a series of devastating, long, quote-unquote, fire seasons. And it meant that in late August, we started experiencing these prolonged periods of such severe air pollution that we were advised to just stay inside with windows and doors sealed, even though the Bay Area where I live was experiencing heat waves with temps soaring over 110, which never happens in the Bay Area. It was truly insane. And then on September 9th, we woke up to these alien, bizarre, dark orange skies as a particulate matter had really blocked out the sun. So it was a couple of weeks when those sort of back of the mind worries about climate change became absolutely immediate and visceral. And we were all very happy when a couple days later, a colleague of ours, Mickey Meng, sent out an email to friends and colleagues really across the art world, especially in California. So these were to museum curators, gallery owners and workers, board members at arts institutions, art dealers, art handlers. Like, she cast an incredibly wide net, but the point of the email was really clear. Like, what are we going to do to help? What can we do to make our professional sector part of a solution as opposed to part of a problem? And within that email, there was an invitation to a Zoom call, which ended up being hands down the largest Zoom call I have ever been part of. It felt like dozens of people. And these participants crossed all different sectors of the art world. And we all recognize some of the problems, big and small, that we face in our workplaces, whether it's unnecessary travel, wasteful installation practices, the environmental impact of these big luxurious buildings we often work in, shipping, parties with imported food and drinks, et cetera, et cetera. But the question is, what are we going to do about it? So that enormous call really narrowed down into weekly conversations with a somewhat fluid but core group. Sometimes these calls have happened at 9:30 p.m. on Friday, but we've been really dedicated to making them happen. And what we realized is that we needed to get our bearings. So we have reached out and made contact with groups across the United States and also in London with the collective there. And we were ecstatic to realize that so many people are already working on this problem. We've also reached out to non-arts focused groups, so officials with the San Francisco city government, for instance, to make sure that our plans of action and efforts really align with theirs. Also to other nonprofits like Earth Justice, which is a nonprofit legal organization here in San Francisco, based in San Francisco, and to major businesses like Apple that have publicly declared their concern about climate change. So in terms of a first year, we want this to be a year of action as much as it's a year of learning. First and foremost, our goal is to build a community. So we have launched a modest initial website, and we'd love to hear from any and all through that resource. And then we've also given a lot of thought to the particularities of the California art world in which we work. So, obviously it goes without saying that climate change is a global crisis, but we felt that starting partnerships with local friends and colleagues and institutions would be the most effective. And among the things that we've realized is that, especially in the Bay Area, nonprofit institutions hold major sway. So we've decided to start with this sector because the carbon footprint of these institutions is no doubt larger, and because their audience is so considerable and plays such a crucial part in the cultural of the region. So within 2021, our goal is to facilitate a climate audit for major arts institutions, 10 different museums or other types of nonprofit arts institutions. These audits might be very big, the whole institution and its operations for a year, or small, a particular exhibition, maybe a department within a museum. But the point is really to get these sites engaged and aware of the specifics of their carbon emissions so that we can enact some new practices. And of course, we realize that we need to also be a resource of guidance once these audits happen. In other words, so when our colleagues turn to us and say, great, we have this information now, what do we do with it? We can offer some productive lines of advice. Currently in California, there's no go-to plan, infrastructurally speaking, about how to cut emissions. I'm thinking that probably goes for most places in the United States. So our aim is to be a place where we can outline options for quickly and effectively moving forward towards carbon neutrality, if not going carbon negative.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jody. Ellen, I'm going to have you give an intro next.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kate, for the invitation. I am Ellen. I am from Art2Zero, which is an organization started in 2019 by 3 art workers here in New York. We all had a shared passion around climate and had been participating within the space in our own time. And in late 2019, really decided to formalize action for the visual arts specifically. Our mission, as Kate introduced, is to accelerate the just transition to a net zero emissions future for the entire visual arts sector. We do this by building capacity for arts organizations of all types and sizes and all individuals to take action on climate. Currently, we engage directly with organizations to develop and or implement climate action plans, meeting them wherever they are in their stage, providing access to resources for embedding environmental sustainability within the main practice areas of the visual arts. We aim to create opportunities for collaboration and knowledge sharing across the sector, as many of my cohorts here also strive to do. We facilitate education and innovation through partnerships with climate experts, climate justice experts here in New York, and forging connections with the local community, partnerships with the city leaders who are part of the ambitious goals of the Climate Mobilization Act here in New York City, as well as the Green New Deal and one in NYC 2050. While stewarding the local process, we are engaged with national and global partners and creating this growing coalition for advocacy and support for industry-wide adoption of climate action. Looking at what we're doing recently, we have partnerships with MOCA in Los Angeles and New York Consolidated, which is a new nonprofit exhibition space and publisher here in New York, rooted in fostering an equitable culture in and through the arts. It's been great to work with an organization from its beginnings. We are not having to rethink or solve problems, but weave a climate lens in from the onset, and focusing on institutions and the connections to the public and to the audience has enormous impact. So we're very excited to be working with them. We really consider ourselves a learning organization. We're learning from each other. Our role is to collect knowledge, serve to organize it in ways that are helpful and meaningful for each actor in our sector, so we can outline priority areas for the most impactful action we can take together, and really strive to normalize daily climate conversation amongst us all.
Thanks, Ellen. I'm now going to have Haley, who is a co-founder of MOCA's Environmental Council, give a little background on how that organization came to be.
Great. Hi, wonderful to speak with you all today. Thank you to Laura, Ellen, and Jody for these introductions, and to Kate for initiating this conversation. Thanks to Art Expo for organizing our panel. And thank you to Njideka Crosby, an artist on the MOCA Environmental Council, and David Zorner Gallery for their suggestion that we participate today. My name is Haley, and I'm an artist and land conservationist. I focus a good deal of my time supporting natural balances for climate change, such as the conservation of living carbon ecosystems and conserving historic carbon landscapes. I grew up in the Bay Area of California, and like Jody said, when we grew up here, there were rarely fires. Things changed about 5 years ago, and now we have a fire season every year. With this in mind, it made sense for me to support MOCA LA in founding the first environmental council for an art museum in the United States. And it's been quite a pleasure to do so, and we've been learning every single day. The director there, Klaus Biesenbach, their deputy director of advancement, Samuel Vasquez, and my council co-founder, David Johnson. We worked for about 1.5 years on preparations, and as Kate said, the museum council was announced this past October. The council is focused on climate conservation and environmental justice in intersection with artist activism and in furtherance with the museum's mission. So there's 7 council members that come from the arts and climate field, and there are 7 council advisors from the field of conservation and sustainability who are collaborating with the museum in support of education, reflection, and meeting target goals. In the council's first year, we felt starting at home made the most sense. So we're working toward institution-wide carbon negativity, carbon-free energy, environmentally focused exhibitions, and just across the board reductions in emissions and consumption, as Laura noted, being a central point of focus and effort for the audits that we're conducting. MOCA plans to publicly document these efforts and progress on a site, a sort of microsite on their page, so that the reference materials can be shared among other institutions and art studios. Some early steps with artists have been Museum Director Klaus Biesenbach's early sort of virtual studio visits with artists such as Anna Aniki to discuss climate, synthetic biology, and environmental justice. And MOCA has an upcoming exhibition with Pipolati Risk that will be carbon neutral, thanks to a very detailed and arduous carbon audit of museum staff members Jill Davis and Meredith Gray. As an artist, it's been a pleasure to engage the initiative, and in accordance with my interests of land conservation and a nonprofit I founded called Art to Acres that we'll talk about a little bit later. I think that this intersection of sustainability, which is sort of walls in, and conservation, which is walls out, is a really interesting conversation and a dynamic one that's unfolding right now, and is really a pleasure to participate in with all these initiatives unfolding.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that intro. And I'm actually going to start with you, Haley. As we open this up to a larger panel conversation, I'm going to have some directed questions to each of the panel members. And then if anyone else wants to kind of jump in to say what their organization is doing kind of along the same lines, that would be fantastic. So Haley, starting with you and thinking about the Environmental Council, can you speak a little bit about the specific collaborations with other environmentally oriented organizations that you guys have started?
Of course. Collaboration is the part of this sustainability work that I'm most enjoying. It's been great to communicate with fellow organizations such as these on the meeting today, Barter Art based in New York, Art+Climate Coalition based in the UK, Julie's Bicycle, also UK, Culture Declares Emergency, and Extinction Rebellion. And those calls are weekly, bi-weekly. I mean, the conversation is very fluid. So it's wonderful to have an initiative that's unfolding while other initiatives are also growing, and we bounce things off of each other. In terms of collaboration, to begin, MOCA contracted with Art2Zero, as Ellen mentioned, and the purpose is both capacity building with a fellow initiative and to engage a neutral third-party advisory team that the museum staff can field as a resource for questions, discussions, to incubate ideas. Every initiative has their own purpose, and ours is really listening, going step by step and focusing on staff-driven and artist-driven actions. Another unfolding collaboration is with the Carbon Accounting Company to conduct a museum-wide carbon emissions audit, which the council will use to support a reduction of carbon emissions in alignment with the Paris Accord goals of a 50% reduction by 2030. And then lastly, I think the central collaborator for the Environmental Council will always be artists and fellow institutions. So the initiative was designed to be a sort of like a node among artist-based activism and worker-driven sustainability initiatives, and to be transparent so that all materials and programming history will be shared on the MOCA site. If another organization wants a PDF for a single-use plastics audit, they can download it, adapt it. And the main purpose of this sharing is to support simple steps that sister organizations can take and use and modify for their own purposes.
Great, thank you. This question is pointed towards Laura and Jody, but also Ellen, if you wanted to jump in as well. I'd love to know what some simple, actionable ways that both galleries and institutions and museums too can be more sustainable. What are also some everyday ways artists can reduce their environmental impact? So kind of thinking of just some simple, direct ways, both as a museum or thinking of an artist or a gallery. Laura, if you maybe want to answer first, that would be great.
Yeah, I'd say that one of the simplest and most available things that we can do are slowing down and planning ahead. I would actually say this is the #1 actionable step to reducing your climate impact, is committing to investing the time, labor, and resources needed to plan ahead for an exhibition. Planning ahead allows you to actually save resources and save money down the line. It allows for using sea freight instead of air freight, which is a fraction of the carbon emissions. It allows you to create an exhibition afterlife checklist for all the materials that you're sourcing, where they're going afterwards, what can be reduced, what can be resold, what can be repurposed. It provides time to research and hire BIPOC or female or local labor that's excited to work with you to develop climate conscious solutions to installation and exhibition development. And it allows you time to support your team so that they're excited and empowered to take the lead on climate conscious actions within their exhibition planning, and that your team's not going home at 10 p.m. every night and ordering takeout 3 times a day and too exhausted to show up outside of work as climate conscious citizens. I'll also say briefly, the action plan that we have for Galleries Commit and this idea of calculating and reducing emissions, minimizing waste, supporting your staff, and shifting paradigms. I think in the past year, those things have become a little bit more clear, like around calculating and reducing emissions. Right now, we actually have some museums and galleries that have done carbon audits and understand what those emissions were. We were not in that place a year ago. It was much more like, where are our emissions? What should we be focusing on? But it's become really clear that shipping, artwork, travel, and your building energy are the three greatest areas of emissions. So when you're doing your planning for an exhibition, really looking at ways that you can be conscious around reducing the impact of those three things. Yeah, and minimizing waste by creating an afterlife checklist for each exhibition.
Great. Jody, if maybe you have some just simple and actionable steps that museums and organizations can take.
Yeah, I mean, I really just echo what Laura was saying, that slowing down and planning in advance to make sure that sort of our values in terms of climate awareness really match our practices. I mean, can be a little confessional coming from a curatorial background, and sometimes the way that we express how much we value artists and the art that they make might be through things like very special bespoke design that's going to be thrown away right after installation of an exhibit, or right after an exhibition comes down, or changing a checklist at the very last minute to tell the perfect story, which might require additional air shipping, things like that. They're done with the best of intentions. It's in order to show how much we value the artwork on display. But with a little advanced planning and a little more awareness, we can put aside some of those more wasteful behaviors and redirect our energy so that we're not creating damage in the process of advocating for the industry and the sector, the cultural sector that we obviously are all dedicated to. And in terms of actual, from studio practice, I think it's important to take that in terms of artist by artist, because it's going to change pretty dramatically according to media. So for instance, in the first two artists that we've reached out to talk to include an artist in California named Tarana Mukherjee, who works in a wide variety of media, everything from large scale installations, sculpture. I've seen digital works of hers. And so I think it's going to be an interesting conversation in terms of, sort of piece by piece, what does she think through in terms of being climate aware as she's working both to make the piece itself and also in preparation for exhibition. California also has a really incredible tradition of photographers. So that's a different set of questions. The actual bulk of an object might be different. Printing might be the concern and shipping, but obviously it's different to ship a large scale sculpture and installation as opposed to a photograph. So I think just being very attuned to an artist's particular needs. And again, to go back to Laura's point of not trying to scramble at the last minute to get things where they need to be and to make them look as fantastic as possible when they're on view is really key.
Yeah, and I'll just tack on to that specifically. I think the number one thing artists can do when you're working with an institution or a gallery to have a more sustainable practice is to uphold deadlines. And from the beginning of engaging with planning for the exhibition is tell the people that are working with you to develop that show that you want the show to be planned from the beginning to be as low climate impact as possible. Engage that conversation from the beginning. When they're giving you deadlines for the work that's going to be included, meet that deadline and also respond like, if I meet that deadline, can we ship it by sea freight, or is there actually should be working towards something even sooner so that we can make this a really low impact exhibition.
Absolutely.
Great. Ellen, do you have anything to add as well?
I just echo Laura as well as Jody, and I think the framework they're setting forward is similar to ours. Measuring, of course, is a big one for us as well. It's just a place to know where you can start from, know where you can set realistic goals around taking climate action. I guess to just piggyback on all of that would just be a simple action. I always say is just how can you normalize these conversations with your peers? If you're talking to a service provider, ask them questions about if they have a sustainability mission. Just really start to embed the conversation in a daily way. Even things like, as a suggestion box of simple actions that your team can take. So just creating that sort of network approach, I think is really simple and doable.
Unmute myself. Laura, I had another question for you. Who do you think can be the leaders in shifting the art world to more climate consciousness?
There's a truck going outside my house, so I hope you can hear me as I answer this question. Yeah. But yeah, I think that leadership is important, but I really think that the climate crisis is an existential crisis that's affecting us all. So it really is everyone that needs to be collectively collaborating. And while there's benefit for competition and leadership, that's really as a way to make sure it's a race to the top, not to emerge as like a single or sole leader in the space. I will say though, coming from the gallery perspective, I think that galleries have a particular opportunity to be a leader that is really exciting to me. And specifically primary market galleries that are working with living artists. I feel like that sounds kind of unexpected or crazy, but galleries that are working with living artists in the primary market are really in some ways uniquely positioned to make rapid and radical change that only requires a buy-in of a very few number of individuals. That's different. We're not accountable to the heavy, slow-moving bureaucracy that can be behind institutional spaces that have boards of directors and publics and official mission statements. We also, as galleries, are often controlling what artwork is actually entering the market from the get-go, and also defining how that work is being presented to collectors and institutions when it starts on a life cycle of circulation. We set what standards are there for the ongoing circulation, exhibition, presentation, and maintenance of the works going into circulation. And we're in direct daily dialogue with our artists. So I would say galleries have increasingly over the past several years taken on more of an advisory role and not just a sales role when we're collaborating with artists. That means that we are spearheading conversations with them about their career integrity and making sure we're advocating for them in the best ways possible to have a lifelong career. And I think right now it's undeniable that part of that is advising our artists and supporting them to figure out ways to make their practices more climate conscious and sustainable, running their studios more climate conscious and sustainable, and that galleries have a really exciting opportunity to be a leader in that space.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura. I want to switch back to Haley for a little bit to talk about Art to Acres, which was mentioned earlier, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into it. Haley, could you tell me in what ways does environmental conservation go hand in hand with art, and talk about how Art to Acres has collaborated to support artists in conservation?
Yeah, of course. I think they go hand in hand really well. Art and land conservation both have aspects of legacy and permanence in their language, and they're both in part what we leave behind for future generations. So both represent time. An artwork represents a moment in time, whereas when you visit a national reserve or conserved area, you see this like visual of all time compounded. So in that way, they're both artifacts. I spend a good deal of my time as an artist conserving land. And I think I knew as a young, person, as I was studying, like maybe I could make some decent paintings in my life, but I was never going to make anything as incredible as a tree. But I could dedicate time in conserving species and supporting the conservation of species in the art community, so that those things continue to survive and continue to evolve and live. And I believe if you do something, you want to also make it accessible to everyone. So when I was in my early 20s, I just sort of made a commitment that I wanted to conserve large-scale full ecosystem landscapes on behalf of myself and other artists and art workers. And I spent about 15 years preparing for this and putting together an advisory group and just learning. Spent a long time learning. I initiated Art to Acres as a method for supporting the art community in engaging like globally recognized large scale areas. So you're talking from 30,000 acres up to millions, that are carbon rich, have a ton of sort of back end research and due diligence, are key biodiversity locations. So like they have usually highly endangered or endemic species, are of indigenous import, and are always like old growth, like carbon dense forests, so primary growth forests. In essence, we mainly work with conserving, using single artworks to conserve single parcels of land, such as like a 3-foot painting can sort of scale up and conserve, you know, tens of thousands of acres of forest. The aim is both like education as to how like a single action can have a sustainable and long-lasting effect, and also to work with artists and gallerists and institutions and their families and sort of have this very personal experience of something unfolding in time, because land conservation is pretty slow. I've worked with around 45 artists and 2 collectors to date, but increasingly there's more like gallery and institutional interest in land conservation. That sort of was stewarded by an artist, Mika Rottenberg, who did an MCA Chicago show, and she added land conservation as part of her line item budget and has continued that practice. And that has then stemmed forward into galleries such as like Parker Gallery in LA, and institutions such as the Guggenheim in New York, conserving on behalf of artists or exhibitions. One such collaboration is a current one we're doing with Galleries Commit that Lauren spoke to support galleries in conserving a single large-scale tropical cloud forest in Peru that's a little under 200,000 acres. This is an action of biodiversity and hydrological importance, but it also has 30 million metric tons of stored carbon in the landscape. So it's also a climate action. It's a key way for gallery workers and organizations to come together in a large-scale environmental action and also come together in a collective action. So more information about that is on their website. As for my time, I work closely with conservation partners such as Global Wildlife and oversee the due diligence, matching funds, audits, et cetera. And a big thing that excites me about conservation is that it's an additive process. It happens like acre by acre. So you can sort of step, and every acre counts and supports our sort of global research proven aims, which is we should conserve 30% of terrestrial surface by 2030 for the climate to like maintain somewhat equilibrium. And so with that in mind, I also founded a website that's in its beta phase called conserve.org, where you can conserve a single acre. But overall, you know, land conservation is one of the most impactful things we can do for climate. Trees are our oldest resource for drawing down carbon. They're our most proven technology. They're our most affordable technology. And one of the great things about conserving landscapes is there's so many added benefits. So it's really a pleasure to work on behalf of artists. And yeah, it's great. That's a little overview.
Thank you for that overview. I'm curious now, Ellen, I have a question for you, but also Laura, Jody, Haley, if you want to respond as well. How do you recommend that artists, museums, galleries, nonprofit organizations set realistic goals when it comes to the adoption of zero waste practices? Things can seem really overwhelming when we're talking about these topics, and I'm curious how you speak to those in your community about these realistic, obtainable goals, and also timelines too.
Yeah, it's impossible to set realistic goals without knowing where you are. So the first step is really chiefly falls within that setting your baseline, doing an environmental assessment and measuring what your organizational footprint is and understand your impact. Then you can design a plan that you can make reductions year by year. What feels achievable? Is it 20% in 3 years? Is it 50% in 5 years? You have to root yourself in the practical to shape those goals. As Laura was saying, you know, we have these metrics that are coming out and have been so generously shared with many galleries specifically. We kind of know the big buckets, being built environment, air travel, and shipping, so we can work within that. In regards to materials and zero waste, we just advocate for a helpful approach to take stock where you are and set policies around materials and procurement. It's the best way to begin. Materials are a big topic for our sector. We have many material enthusiasts. We work with artists. It's certainly an area people want to talk about and share ideas around innovation. So that's a really exciting opportunity for every actor to reimagine and be an agent of change. So we can codify the principles of reduction and reuse, but it's also easy actions like make a list of materials, like what's in your index of operations, ask simple questions. What's being used that is single use, it's environmentally harmful, can that be eliminated? Where do you use a material often where maybe there's an alternative that exists? And then just stepping outside of that walls in, as Haley always likes to say, you know, where can those moments of unavoidable consumption be followed by moments of restoration, like, you know, an opportunity to commit to a land project. So yeah, and then small actions, as we're saying, you know, one of my co-founders, Charlotte, initiated composting in her office on her own accord. And she said it was just really valuable and sort of fascinating how that big, you know, generic garbage cans just got smaller and smaller and smaller. And there's a lot of resources out there as well. One of our global partners, Key Culture, just published it's an available resource. It's a materials and waste handbook for our sector. So anyone who really wants to do a deep dive into thinking about materials and zero waste, that's a great resource that's out there. And I know Galleries Commit has a lot of conversation around this topic as well of zero waste.
I would just say that one thing that's exciting is that all of these examples of other individuals, groups, institutions taking action are becoming more publicly pronounced and available. So in other words, when we might talk to a local museum, we can point to MOCA, we can point to the Guggenheim, we can point to a gallery who is already taking these steps. And it just breaks down that wall of inertia of it just feels too big, it feels too big. So I think that as we continue to communicate and build these networks of action and advocacy, it really helps in getting additional people to take those small steps. It becomes possible because someone else has done it, you know.
Yeah, that's great. Laura, do you have anything else to add to?
Ellen kind of mentioned that Galleries Commit had conversations about minimizing waste, and I think that a couple things that have been really people have found really useful within our collective is echoing what Ellen said, making waste transparent. So there's kind of an active idea for both carbon emissions and waste to find ways to, on a monthly basis, have an email circulated within your staff that's like, these were our carbon emissions from last month. This was the number of pounds of waste or like oversized waste that we put out on the street last month. And then ideas for ways that could have been reduced. And especially for like a first year of making climate action, it's not necessarily holding people accountable to totally change their practices, but it's really making it in your face so that data and information, you're aware of what the impact is, and constantly being reminded of ideas that you could have done to reduce it. I would also, for zero waste, then I'd also call out the importance of being mindful of where you're sourcing materials from. So opting for things like, instead of choosing just going to an overnight shipment with Amazon Prime or Uline, then prioritizing local businesses and planning ahead again so that it has time to ship with you in more consolidated shipments.
Perfect. And I just want to remind our audience that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the YouTube chat and we will bring them into this conversation. And I think one came in about where you can find more information about all of these organizations. We have links to all of them on the microsite, program.expochicago.com. So you can just click and find out how to participate, learn more information, join an email list. So all of those are available on our site. And as people are developing questions, I have another that I would like to pose to the full group. Really thinking about the Paris Agreement, can you speak a bit about what your organization is doing to support the goal to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2030 in line with this agreement? And maybe I can start with Jody.
So this is a little bit anecdotal, but one of the most eye-opening moments we had was in talking with a group in London called the Art+Climate Coalition about their work with institutions, collaborations with places like the Tate, big British museums. And, you know, they noted, well, it's not that hard to get people to collaborate because they're part of the Paris Accord. And so they have to, like, they're going to have to make these changes. And it was such a gut punch. This happened before the election and before the inauguration, obviously. And, you know, we were just left with like, oh, not only do we have the task of convincing people to do an audit, to take account of their wasteful practices, to implement change, but there's just so much more, you know, persuasion that seems to be necessary. And it's such a relief to now know that, you know, we're going to have to do this collectively and that we can be part of that solution. I think it's just one more sort of bit of information in approaching potential partners to bring up, you know what, we're going to do this together across the country, across the globe, hopefully. So let's get started now. And let's draw on the pools of information, knowledge that already exist and build.
Great. Ellen, yeah.
Yeah, just echoed Jody. I mean, Paris goals serve as an opportunity to unify so many sectors and connect to the ambitious goals set by thousands of cities and governments internationally. So with that, it allows for us as a sector to engage with and be tied to something larger than us. It offers a point of connection and education to what's already been well-defined and well understood by science and policy. And we can also unite around larger campaigns. Art2Zero has been in dialogue and starting a partnership with the SME Climate Hub, which is part of the UN Race to Zero campaign, for example. And there's numerous collaborative opportunities there outside the avenue of visual arts alone, but opportunity to learn from experts and learn what's working in other sectors. And all of us here have sort of recently set up a global coalition where we can regularly check in with one another and support each other's work and determine ways to better align frameworks around thinking about Paris Agreement more specifically.
Haley, do you have something to add from your end about the Paris Agreement and reducing carbon emissions by 50% by 2030?
Yeah, I think Jody, Laura, and Ellen really covered most of the points. I would say, I think to resound a little bit on what Ellen mentioned about these initiatives forming. When I started with Art to Acres, there just wasn't a lot of peer support, or there just wasn't that sort of energy. And in the last year and a half, things have really grown. There's so many different initiatives, fellow initiatives globally and throughout the US. And those dialogues are exceptionally encouraging and supportive. And I think that having frameworks allows people to know when to show up, know when to talk. Like Laura's been supporting like this artist commit thing that's just beginning. And that's so exciting for artists. And so I think a framework like the Paris Accord is very generative. It's generous in the sense that people can come in from different places. They can support different sorts of carbon drawdown, carbon sequestration, or carbon protection, different kinds of technologies that need to come about, but mostly a focus on education, because we can't reduce without learning first. And I think that educational space is one of the most exciting because it's a space of awareness, you know, like carbon dioxide as a gas isn't something we see or smell or really think about because we don't see it or smell it. And so this notion of just starting to be aware of almost the immaterial is a sensory level that I think I'm excited for humanity to start to extend themselves into more.
Great. And Laura, if you could answer the question too, and then maybe talk a little bit about Artist Commit as well.
Yeah, I think that what I find really interesting about the Paris Climate Accord and being able to emerge right now, all of a sudden having a Biden administration and looking into a future where we are in a post-vaccine COVID reality, is that 2020 in a lot of ways, as horrendous as it was also an opportunity for us to take a pause and really have a year of space where exhibitions were on pause, art fairs were on pause, travel was on pause, and we were able to really dive in and do some of the necessary groundwork that was required for all of us to find each other, all of us to really engage in thoughtful, ongoing dialogues and conversations. And something that I think is really key about the Paris Climate Accord is that that was never going to be achieved just by federal regulations. And I don't think that the art sector, and especially the commercial art sector, was ever going to be a primary target of regulation or something that people were focusing on. And this past year has allowed us to actually start building these networks that are going to be necessary for us to take self-led action to meet those goals. That isn't necessarily something we can rely on the federal government to do or people outside of us to do. But it's really about all of us coming together to step into our own power for figuring out how we're going to meet these global goals. And then Art+Commit is a kind of offshoot. As part of Galleries+Commit, we have almost 100 artist signatures that signed on to the Galleries+Commit initiative. And several of those artists have been engaging in ongoing conversations about what it looks like to specifically step into that commitment through the perspective of an artist, what type of resources they might need, how that could evolve. So I would say those are early conversations, but it's an example of the way starting to do action, and something that Jody mentioned earlier, when that action is done in the public sphere, even if it's not fully thought out, or you don't know all the right answers, or it's not quite the perfect commitment or the perfect resource yet, by doing it in a space that encourages experimentation and collaboration in a public space, it allows for dialogue and it allows for evolution and being understanding of areas of growth and supportive of the overall forward movement that we need to be making. And Art+Commit is a really exciting space where that is also starting to have some experimentation and growth.
Perfect. As you were talking, a audience question came in that really relates back to this conversation around the Paris Climate Accord. This week, we've seen President Biden sign several executive orders that relate to climate change, for example, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. In what ways do each of you think art can influence heads of state in their decision-making on both a national and global scale? And maybe I'll start with Haley. Yes.
That's a great question. Well, I'll just speak as an artist. I think as a young person, one of the things that attracted me to art was that it crossed all sorts of boundaries. Like, you didn't have to speak the language. You know, I could look at a painting from a completely different culture, a completely different time. And there's something exceptionally generative and generous in the way an artwork can both be effective, like literally affect the reverberations in your understanding of something, and also can be educational in the sense that you leave it different. And I think that's what some great artworks do, is they really change how you see things. So I think, like, on a very basic level, I think great art strives to connect you with a sense of reflection, but also a sense of like looking forward and like proposing, how can we be a best version of ourselves? And what does that mean? Like, what are we valuing? Because I think we do look back to periods of time, and we look at the artworks to see what a culture valued. And, for us to continue to maintain the quality of life, and for the globe to continue to be the great place it is to live, and to evolve, we need to have a sustainable temperature and sustainable weather systems. And I think in terms of the Paris Accord, Paris Accord is just a very core framework to look at climate, and climate itself is a term that just defines long-term weather. So we're talking about weather here, and that's a pretty transitory, but also pretty fundamental thing. It's an exciting thing. And I think it's something that artists from all different walks of life and places in the world are going to be able to engage in their own way. And I think that inclusivity and that diversity is really exciting. And I'm looking forward to the art of this decade very much.
That's a great response. Jody, Ellen, Laura, does anyone else have anything to add to that audience question?
I mean, I would just quickly add something that has resonated and stuck with me. I've been listening to a lot of panels with people in the climate space and sort of talking about what's been missing from these years and years of work. And they're sort of coming away with, we have this incredible toolbox of solutions, but it's about bringing those solutions to fruition at the speed and scale required, demands going beyond the solutions, but how we use them and how we talk about them. And some have rightly look to culture, look to storytelling. They're saying sort of that's who's been missing perhaps from this story. So I just found that to be really inspiring recently to think a little bit about that and where culture has a role to play, because this is really a story about humanity and the human agenda. So
yeah. I would echo that and say I think people will turn to the arts increasingly in terms of understanding and sort of a collective mind shift. One of the things that really stuck out to me when we were talking to some people from San Francisco's local government is, their attitude was sort of like, yeah, we have the infrastructural knowledge, we have the technical knowledge to make the shifts that we need to make. But they're just so excited to have people from the arts because of our audience, membership, the education potential, the potential to really promote critical thinking about these issues and creative solutions. So it was sort of like we were looking at them to provide the technical answers, and they were looking at us to be models of how to think through some very sticky problems, but also to imagine a world that looks different than the one we have now. And I think that's an incredible opportunity.
Amazing. Laura, do you have anything to add to?
I think mostly echoing what Haley and Ellen and Jody have already said, and also maybe pointing out that I think artists are in a really interesting space because they are creative thinkers who are designed to think outside of the box or how they're approaching certain problems. Some of the greatest creativity comes from restrictions of certain parameters that you have to work around. And so being able to approach your practice and the type of work that you're making, not necessarily just in the message of the work being about climate conscious things, but actually the way you're approaching creating that work and displaying that work has a lot of flexible potential that's not always true for other industries like fashion or other forms of production that have these long production pipelines of warehouses and factories and assembly lines. There's a lot of freedom to really be nimble on your feet and shift practices and experiment with creative solutions.
Thank you. And we had just one final question come through the chat. Do you think that there's a role that collectors will need to fill to create a holistic approach to sustainability? I'm not sure if maybe that strikes anyone wanting to respond first.
I'll respond. One of the council members for MOCA is Brian Sheff, and his collections advisor, Temple Shipley, joins the calls. We meet twice a month. And she's been really focused on sustainable collections development. And I think that there's going to be increasing space and a need for sustainable advisory engagements, but also looking at, storage of artworks, temperature controlled, what you circulate, and how things are shipped. And I think that collectors are going to have a huge opportunity and also responsibility to start to engage more prudent carbon practices on behalf of art shippers and request those or demand those options. Also just to be aware, what is the carbon footprint of my shipment? You should know that along with the cost. So we worked with ARTA this year on conserving land on behalf of some of their engagements, and they did a full carbon neutral audit for the year and learned so much internally as a shipping company. But I think also now want to pass that on to their clients. So I think that there's a lot of space that collectors can engage here and actually have also a lot of influence in the space, which is at times very important. I think Ellen might have some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, definitely. my co-founders, have worked in the collection advisory space. So it's something we've talked about quite a bit. And throughout 2021, we will be engaging more with advisory and collections management practitioners. And there's a lot of enthusiasm there, I have to say. And anyone who maybe was assuming there would be a bit of reticence, it's actually something that is really being prioritized. We're getting a roundtable together and have a lot of people who have asked about this. So I think I definitely echo Haley. I think it's something that's going to be emerging even more so in the next few months.
Great. And I think that actually takes us right up to time. I really enjoyed speaking with all of you and really learning about your insight and more about your organizations. Just wanted to reiterate that links to all of these organizations are on the microsite for more information. Also want to just thank again MOCA LA for partnering on this talk. We are really excited about the Environmental Council and so excited to have everyone listening in today. So thank you so much to everyone and hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.